Growing up, we used to receive the paper. I know today most people get it online. They may not get the paper, but I always look forward to getting the paper, opening it up, and going to the comic strip, which I'm not sure today even if people read the comics. I know on my Kindle version of the Orlando Sentinel, the comics don't come up on there. Maybe that would be a good idea for them to have that on there. But I know that I used to go to the Peanuts comic strip, and it was always the first one in Newsday. I grew up on Long Island, and there in Long Island, it was right there on the top one, the Peanuts comic strip. And I have to admit that I know that Peanuts was very well loved. It was one of the most popular comic strips in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And Charles Schulz wrote for over 50 years these comic strips and created them. He made over 17,000 of them, actually, until the year 2000. But I read it week after week. I have to admit, I never really understood it. It never really made a whole lot of sense to me, and I think I realize now why. It's because it was all children in the comic strip, but they thought like adults. So all of the comments that were there, the thought processes, the little bubbles that came out of their head, it was more adult thinking. So as a child, I didn't quite understand that. Maybe I need to go back to all of them, all 17,000, and read them now, and maybe I'll learn something more. But I have to say it was a very creatively done strip because of the fact that the children was kind of a good reflection of what society is like and how people operate, a little bit of psychology going on. You know, Charlie Brown hung around with kind of a motley crew of people who were all kind of needy. After all, Linus always had to have a blanket. Pigpen was filthy and a mess, needed a shower and a bath. And Snoopy did nothing but daydream and do devotions to Our Lady of the Pillow on top of the doghouse there. If you think about it, like they all kind of were sort of needy-like, if you're not familiar with it. Also, Charlie Brown, and this is really what I thought about with our scriptures today, is that Charlie Brown was a model of perfect failure. Because everything he tried and did, he never seemed to be successful at it, but he never gave up. So whether it was a baseball game, he never won. Whether it was a test, he always got a D- on the test. Whether it was the football, Lucy always took the football from him. And maybe it was the Great Pumpkin, which by the way is on TV this week on Tuesday night on ABC, I believe, is the fact that the Great Pumpkin, I'm sorry to spoil it, but he doesn't show up ever. And they're always waiting for it. So it was one failure after another. But Charlie Brown never gave up. He never gave up. He had a sense of perseverance and a sense of persistence. A lot like we see in the gospel reading today. We see this judge and we see the woman who is the widow. And the widow was considered kind of a misfit of society because she didn't fit in anywhere. It was very sad in that particular culture. She was not accepted. She wasn't really respected anywhere. And then we have this judge who, he was kind of seedy. He really didn't have a good sense of what his job was, which was to promote justice, not to give in to everybody, but to promote the gift of justice. And he didn't know really what that meant. So this tells us a couple things in this particular story. One is the fact of the judge who, it should tell us that if he was able to finally come to some sort of terms with this lady, and he was able to be generous or to do something for her, how much more will God be with us? How much more will God be with us? That God is trustworthy and God is generous to us. So we have to realize that she didn't give up. She kept knocking on the door, saying, I want a just judgment. But he finally kind of said yes. And he was not a great character. But just think of how much more God will be with us. So this is a story about God, not just about the woman, about the widow. Secondly, it is a story about her and about her persistence, that she doesn't give up, that even in the midst of all of her helplessness, she said, I'm not going to give up. I'm going to keep going, and I'm going to keep going on and asking. So this is telling us something about prayer, which we heard about in the first reading from Moses. What was Moses? Moses was persistent. And Moses had this idea that if he put his staff up in the air in his arms, that in the battle they would win. And as long as his arms were up, they were winning. If he put his arms down, they weren't winning. So his friends got involved and said, we're going to help him with that. So prayer is something we don't do just alone, but it's something we do with other people. So I have to say, last week I spoke about why do we come to Mass on Sunday. Another reason we come to Mass on Sunday is to pray together. That we realize our prayers are not just us going to God, but it's everybody going to God. And we're all going knocking on God's door. And when we all go knocking on God's door, we do it in community. So for Moses' helpers who were there, they were there to help lift his arms up. What do we do for each other? We help lift our arms up in the gift of prayer, in that position of being open to God's will. And really, that's what prayer does. And I think that that's something we have to remember. Two things about prayer that we need to remember is, one, is that we very often think it's about us looking for God. That prayer is about us connecting with God. And look at how good I am. I'm going to knock on God's door every day, and I say my night prayers, and I do my morning prayers. It's about more than that, folks. It's not just about us finding God. Our prayer should be about God finding us. And that means that sometimes in our prayer, it's not just about sitting and talking to God, it's also listening. It's also listening. It's saying, Lord, I'd like the grace to be able to be found. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. I once was lost, I now am found. That's what we do in prayer. It should be grace-filled moments of our day. It could be the highlight of our day to say, Lord, I'm here, find me. Secondly, prayer does not change God's mind. We have to realize that we don't change God's mind. That's not really the point of it. It's rather to change us. And it helps conform us to God's will, to a sense of acceptance of God's will, to a sense of understanding of God's will, to a sense of being able to be more in union with God. That's what we want. That here on this earth, we have a separation from God. But one day in heaven, we'll be united with Him. So let's start now in being united with Him to say, Lord, I don't understand your will. I certainly don't understand. God's ways are not our ways. But I will tell you that we can come to maybe not an understanding or full acceptance, but our life is a journey towards that as we pray in the Our Father, your will be done. So today, as we hear these readings, should be a chance for us to realize we're called upon in prayer to keep knocking, to be persistent, but also to have a healthy understanding of what prayer is and what prayer does and can do for us. Maybe in our prayer, we're a lot like Charlie Brown. But just remember, he went on and on and on, and he kept going on. And something tells me he's going to go on in the hearts and the minds and the imagination for generations to come.